Hi, everyone. My name is James Vanatakis, and I'm the Executive Director of the Australian American Fulbright Commission. And welcome to this edition of In Conversations. So one of the greatest threats facing humanity has been said to be climate change, human-induced climate change. And we see the impacts around us all the time, from bushfires to rising sea levels. And the latest report by the International Panel on Climate Change highlighted some of the risks that we're likely to face. Worse climate patterns, hurricanes, they're just accentuating all the time. Now, the question is, how do we feel about it? And to help us respond to this sort of sense of despondency that we often feel, we are lucky enough to be joined by 2019 Fulbright Scholar Dan Sherrell. Now, Dan's written a very, very different book about climate change. He's written a book called Warmth, Coming of Age at the End of Our World. It's actually a letter that he's writing to a future child, a child that he's sort of made up in his mind and said, how would he respond to this future child when he comes to talk to them about climate change and the state of the world? So, Dan, thank you so much for joining us. Maybe we can begin by telling us about the inspiration behind your book.
So my book is called Warmth, and I wrote most of it in Australia on my Fulbright grant. But I wrote it in a time in my life where I'd been very active in the American youth climate movement for the better part of a decade, since I was about 18. And started in a student capacity, trying to get my university to divest its endowments from the coal industry, and continued in a professional capacity, running campaigns mostly in New York State and also federally to try to pass policies that were commensurate with the scale of the crisis. But even though it was the thing that I was waking up every day to engage in, the climate crisis itself, the raw reality of it, was still sort of abstracted for me. Like, I was lost in the trenches of emails and conference calls. And I think, like many people, when they think about the climate crisis, had constructed this little compartment that I could keep in the back of my head where it lived, and I didn't really have to examine it that closely. But then there would be mornings, every once a blue moon, once every few months, where I would wake up and something would trigger a realization of the full weight of the problem, and I would feel crushed, like almost literally crushed, like I couldn't get out of bed, given the gravity of the thing. And I could feel like this knot of thought and feeling about the emotional and metaphysical weight of the climate crisis sort of getting tighter and tighter in my chest the more I did this work. And I kind of intuited, if I wasn't able to like unspool that knot and to look into those moments of overwhelm and unfold them and see what they contained, then something in me was going to break. I wasn't going to be able to keep doing this work. And that's my plan for what my life's work is going to be. So I set out first to read a book. I love literature. I love novels. I process a lot through them. And, a lot of the books around climate change are often grouped into this category called cli-fi, climate fiction, that kind of displaces the problem into a dystopian future and uses it as a sort of plot premise. And I was desperate to find a book that contended with, like, because the climate crisis is not a future thing. We are in the throes of it right now, and it is going to get worse before it gets better. And let's hope it gets better. That's our responsibility. But I wanted to read a book that contended with the weight of living in 2021 under this pall, where everything we thought we knew about what the world how the world worked and what it was and what we could expect from it in the future was being upended. And I didn't really find that book, so I decided to try to write one, both as a sort of autotherapeutic process, and to sort of break the climate crisis out of what felt to me like a pretty narrow discursive box, where it was talked about scientifically or technocratically, or from a policy perspective, all of which are vitally important. But it's also like the planet our species has called home for its entire duration is changing radically, is changing at a pace sort of unprecedented in geological history, And that is happening all within our lifetimes, not even within our lifetimes, within a single decade. And so it felt to me like that we have some emotional and spiritual processing to do around this. This is not, if the bureaucrats and the glaciologists are the only ones really contending with this thing, then the rest of us will not be ready for life in the 21st century. And so how do we begin to take the problem out of that little compartment we put it in and actually sit with its weight and develop a relationship to it? Because it's going to really affect our lives for the remainder of our lives.
It's been interesting because hearing you speak, when I was growing up, I studied, when I was in high school, I studied history, ancient history and modern history. They were my two favorite subjects. And I always look at, really important global events, be it the French Revolution or the American Revolution, or, the ancient history with the war in Persia and so on. And I often think to myself, what was someone my age thinking when this was happening? What were they contemplating, and what could they have done to have altered events? And I suppose, as the climate crisis is unfolding before our eyes, one of the thoughts I've had is that someone, hopefully in 100 years' time, will be looking, going, what was my equivalent thinking 100 years ago, right? And I think that part where you talk about it's almost like a chance to kind of write out those feelings. So you're right, we don't talk through these moments about the climate crisis. We more, like you said, are captured by technocratic and bureaucratic talk, which is important in itself, but it's those emotional moments that I think, when I've heard you speak, have been really, really powerful. So within that context, I mean, what's been some of the reaction that people have had when they've accessed your book and they've heard you speak? Like, what's been some of the feedback that you've had?
The feedback has been pretty amazing, not only in the traditional sense of like, oh my gosh, I loved your book, but I think people are really, holding a lot of grief and overwhelm and just confusion around this problem sort of by themselves in an emotional silo. And so to have access to the sounding board of this book, I think, has been meaningful to a lot of people I've spoken to the extent that I've had a few people who've read it, loose acquaintances, send me letters to their own children about the climate crisis that they were prompted to write after reading the book, which that's like about the best engagement you can hope for. I think for, a lot of the people I love who've read it, despite us having a very close relationship, we've never really spoken vulnerably about what's happening with the climate crisis, and what it means for each of us and for the both of us. And it's opened up a space to have that conversation seriously in a way that we don't, we don't brush it aside in like a sort of with dark humor or with sort of, one of two cop-out responses, which is either like, well, it'll probably turn out, the technology, et cetera, or like, we're totally screwed, why talk about it, which I both think aren't, they're both a kind of fatalism, and this book is stridently anti-fatalistic, I think. I did a book event with Bill McKibben, which was really fantastic, and randomly Rebecca Solnit, who's one of my favorite American essayists, was at the event and this is a Zoom event because we're in COVID, and she was hanging out in the chat, and so we connected afterwards and spoke for a while, which was amazing. I mean, it is a crazy thing as a writer to meet your idols, and I wasn't disappointed with either. They totally lived up to expectations. But she speaks a lot about hope as like being very different than optimism. Optimism is a kind of fatalism, and it purports to a confidence that can't be achieved. But I think hope, when it comes to the climate crisis, is merely the realization that there's a vast degree of uncertainty about how this is going to land. And there's no point in consigning ourselves to one particular outcome right now because we don't know. And we can also affect it. And between the poles of, 2 degrees Celsius of warming, which is very bad and will cause suffering for lots of people, but is potentially something our civilization can adapt to, versus 3, 4, or even 5 degrees of Celsius warming, at which point the social fabric begins to unwind in a pretty extreme way, and we can't feed and hydrate everybody. Every 100th of a degree in temperature, we move the needle between those 2 poles, saves or consigns millions of lives. So I think that's been a discussion I've been having with people who come to the book and have felt overwhelmed, is like, actually, the moral stakes of this and our ability to affect its outcome are still really high. In fact, perhaps higher than they've ever been.
Yeah, and I think, actually part of my PhD was about the concept of hope. And I talk in my PhD about hope as a verb, not as, like you said, as an optimism, as this sort of sitting back and just sort of saying, oh yeah, I hope for the world to get better, and I just sit at home and just let things around me with this sort of passive process. I argue that hope can be an active verb, and that's what creates opportunities for change. And I think that's been part of what I've liked about your writings and your words, is that sense of, we can do something about this. We don't have to be passive, and we need to think forward about what can be done. And I think that's a really empowering, rather than like I said, a lot of the literature tends to be very disempowering, tends to undermine our feelings. But if I can just actually go back a little bit, maybe take a couple of steps back, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about how your time in Australia influenced, because you were in Australia as part of a Fulbright, and maybe you can tell us a little bit how your time in Australia influenced your thinking, and how this led to this was part of the journey towards the book.
Yeah, I'd say 2 things. First of all, this book, just like logistically, would not have been possible without my time in Australia. Because in the States, I'm an organizer, and I'm sort of embroiled in the world of climate movement and politics, and it's a hard world to step away from and get enough silence and space to be alone with your thoughts and then write them down on paper. So going all the way across the world and having an office of my own, where all I had was my non-internet capable laptop on which to type, that was just a godsend in terms of time and space. And the book wouldn't have happened without it. But in terms of my thinking, the most formative experience I had in this regard in Australia was the month and a half I actually spent up in the Kimberley. My academic host, Dr. Stephen Mukey, who's an amazing scholar and guy, he really was a sort of in loco parentis for me while I was in Australia, and just knew all the cool people. I had a fun time riding his coattails. But he had a very long-standing relationship with the Gulara tribe up near Broome, and had been going out there to walk their songline with them every summer for like 40 years. And so this year I got to go along with him. We piled into his ute and drove across the outback, which was an adventure in itself, and then hung out in the Gulara bush camp for a few weeks. My bed was like a piece of plywood balanced on 4 50-gallon oil drums with a kind of like dome of mosquito netting around it. It was paradise, honestly, for me. Right near the beach, you could it was in a vine thicket, but you could hear whales breaching offshore at night. It was just magical. And then we spent 9 days walking the songline with them, a songline that incidentally they had campaigned to save from development by a natural gas company several years prior, and won this amazing David versus Goliath campaign against that company. And I think, so I ended up writing a whole chapter in the book just about that experience. And I think what was incredible to me about that experience was being in the midst of people who really, in a profound way, like a way that may like transcend thought, because I can understand these things rationally, but I still have a hard time inhabiting this worldview, is like not really holding that many ontological differences between human people and non-human animals, or even just like the inanimate structures of the landscape. Like all of those things being involved in a society, just like we in the West think of society as like this people and the institutions we build. I think being privy to a culture that saw, for whom the bounds of society did not stop at the human, but actually incorporated rocks and water and beaches and sky and whales and goannas. And actually, that system had a whole network of debts and obligations and histories and commiserations. That was just an amazing, it was amazing intellectual tradition to be exposed to in reality. And yeah, it just gave me a good a very useful like alternative cosmology against which to weigh some of, I think, the blindered ways of thinking in the West that have gotten us into this predicament in the first place. And yeah, I have some, probably the weirdest sections of the book are about 2/3 of the way through, where I'm really trying to establish like how, in what way is our relationship to time and to objects kind of, what's the sickness at the heart of those relationships that has led to the climate crisis, and what might be some alternatives? So they're pretty abstract questions, but I think, I don't know, Australian Aboriginal cosmologies have like really fascinating answers to some of those questions. And I was able to at least touch the hem of some of those garments, although the complexity of that body of thought is just like totally overwhelming and something that you can't really fully contend with in a month and a half, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you touch on that, the world's view. And, again, some of my earlier work was around the concept of land ownership, and sort of compared sort of, I suppose, the idea of ownership in the sort of the more traditional Western thinking about ownership compared to, say, in places such as, Fiji or different parts of the Pacific. And, and it's a different, it's a radical different relationship that, like you said, it's an ontology that's almost impossible to grasp. Like you think it's almost like you think you've got it, but you still end up looking at it from our tradition of where we've grown up and seen the world for our lives. So it is a difficult concept to grasp. I totally understand that sort of. It's almost like staring at a sketch which isn't quite formed, and you kind of try and grasp it, but you almost get there. But I mean, talking about the Pacific, you also spent time in Tuvalu as part of your Fulbright. And the Pacific nations are obviously on the front line of sea rises and sort of climate change. I mean, maybe, and it was an ethnographic study. So can you tell us a little bit about about the time there and how that impacted your perceptions as well?
Yeah, absolutely. That was an incredible trip. Probably the best travel experience of my life, going to Tuvalu, because it's a nation state of 14,000 people, 9,000 in the capital Funafuti. So it has many institutions of a nation state, but it's also culturally a small town. And it has basically zero tourist infrastructure to speak of, because it's one of the smallest and most remote places you could choose to go on vacation. So, my contact there was the director of the University of South Pacific Funafuti, who had invited me to do some climate writing workshops with the students at the university. And she knew everybody. So like as soon as I stepped off the airport, I was just like completely integrated into this community, and welcomed. And I was like at so-and-so's house for dinner. And then I was on so-and-so's, the back of their motorbike as we were speeding up and down the island. And it was just, I met the former prime minister. Like, it's just a very small place, and the writing workshops were really amazing. I mean, obviously average knowledge of and activity around the climate crisis is far, far higher in Tuvalu and 20-somethings than it is in their American or Australian counterparts. I would say it's it's the norm to be involved in climate activism in some way there, rather than the exception. But they'd never really, so, I made friends with a bunch of, young people, a few years younger than me, but about my age, who had, gone to the last Conference of the Parties, UN COP meeting. They went to one in New York. I believe they went to one in Paris. They were kind of like steeped in the process of like international climate negotiations. But according to the director of the university, this is the first time they'd ever held a writing workshop at the university's South Pacific Funafuti, let alone one focused on the climate crisis, which was a thing that's really on people's minds there for obvious reasons. And what surprised me about it, I was expecting it, to the extent that I had expectations at all, I was imagining it to be sort of a space of mourning. And it was that, but it was also, I think the resiliency demonstrated by those young people was like, they've developed a lot of responses to it, They have humor, they have anger, they have grief. They have a sort of like, kind of the blase shoulder shrug of teenagers is sometimes the strategy. Just the diversity of emotional strategies you saw on display in their work was like really impressive. And I was like, oh, this is what resilience looks like. It's not a one note thing, but it's really doing a full integration of like your emotional palette onto this massive societal forcing. And, it's unclear what's going to happen to the islands of Tuvalu, like how the geomorphology works, like if they're actually going to go underwater or not. But what is happening is that the saltwater table is rising inexorably. So they, in many places where they grew crops of taro, which was a huge sustaining a staple crop there, they can no longer do that. And also just the freshwater table is getting thinner and thinner. So I think if they become uninhabitable, which is a real risk and would be a devastating tragedy, it will be because of food and water insecurity first, and not actual submergence of the islands. And yeah, already it's a food desert. I mean, besides for the food that they harvest there, coconut and some of the freshest sashimi you'll ever taste. And I had some incredible meals there. The ingenuity with cooking with coconut was unbelievable. I had no idea there were so many different parts of the coconut. So I had some of the best meals of my life there. And also the baseline is like you eat fried chicken and French fries, because that's what can make it over on the boat from Fiji. And maybe some like dented apples and like soggy carrots, but yeah, it's a massive food desert, and the climate crisis is making that problem worse.
So we talked about in the introduction how your book is about writing a letter to your future children. Not to spoil the ending, but what are your thoughts now on starting a family with?
I get asked this question a lot, obviously, and I suppose I set myself up for it. By the end of the book, I don't answer yes or no conclusively. A, because obviously that's a decision that would be made in concert with my partner. But B, because I didn't want to, in this book, do the thing that you're incentivized to do, especially in the age of internet content creation, which is to like land on a take and then like defend that take to the death. I think I still feel ambivalent about it in many ways. And what I wanted to defend is the space to be ambivalent a little bit, and to have the grappling be an end in itself, which frankly it was for me. I mean, writing a letter to my child, my hypothetical future child, was a way into a kind of, I basically invented this person as an interlocutor with whom I could have a vulnerable conversation about the climate crisis. So it was a device in some ways to get under the skin of a certain kind of conversation I wanted to have. I will say, I basically unavoidably arrived at the conclusion that I think adopting a child in 2021 is probably the most ethically defensible position. But I also think that, you know, looking at the climate crisis and how royally we've soiled the bed, and I say we, I really don't mean everybody. I think most people have an infinitesimally small share of the responsibility here. It's mostly a very few multinational companies that essentially wage a propaganda campaign so they could make money while they drove civilization off a cliff. You know, there's this question of like, is the human project worth continuing, given how badly we've screwed things up? And on that, I think I do believe that yes, the human project is worth continuing. And as far off course as we are, we're endlessly malleable and capable of great beauty. And so to the extent that creating a next generation is a vote for the continuation of the human project and the betterment of the human project, I think that's still, yeah, I think that's still a worthwhile thing. So that's probably not as satisfying as an answer as you want, but you know,
I think it's a great answer, and I think it's yeah, it does loop us around to that concept of hope as being active rather than just sort of we sit around passively and wait, you know, as you know, wait for things to happen around us. But then we'll leave it there. I just really want to thank you for your time, and once again, congratulations on the book. It's fantastic to have you joining us. It's just such a great part of the Fulbright family to have you and these conversations are great. So thanks so much, and enjoy the rest of the tour on promoting the book, and good luck in your future endeavors.
Thanks so much. It's been really nice to maintain this connection, and I hope to make it back to Australia at some point in the near future.
I hope so. Thanks.